Yeah, I think that the interesting part is defensively, like you bring up. I mean, you look what's committed now, you look what's still out in play, and you probably know better than I, but this has a chance to be, at least recruiting wise on paper, as good a recruiting class. You brought in better overall linebackers over the
Mhm.
years. I mean,
Individual guys. Yeah.
individual guys. Yeah, Jalen Smith was about as big a defensive recruit as I can remember in the history
Hmm.
of since this thing's been going on. Manti Te'o, the same thing. Um, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah wasn't as highly
Right.
recruited, not highly touted at least, but you saw that he was going to be a playmaker once he's able to get healthy and get on the field there. But in terms of the actual depth of this, that's where I see
Hmm.
one of the big differences too. And I mean, you noticed it in the game against Clemson in 2018's Cotton Bowl. As soon as Dante Vaughn went down, you saw this thing just the
Yeah.
wheels come off right
Yeah.
away, and it was just a simple, all right, 1 through 25 or so on the roster, 1 through 30 outside of Trevor Lawrence and the quarterback difference. It's a big difference.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. Don't get it short sighted. Notre Dame stacked up with Clemson then. You start to factor in, okay, get to a second team, start to get some alternates in there, start to get in reserves based off of injury. Notre Dame didn't have the horses to compete, and I think that was obvious from that second there. And I think that the depth has added
Hmm.
significantly here. I don't know if it's there yet, and I think that some of the positions that you highlighted and some of the things you brought up there is speak to where the gaps still remain and what has to be filled, what has to be fixed.
I think the cornerback position is one where that gap is still significant. I
Mm-hmm.
think when you look at the front seven, I don't think Notre Dame's front seven takes a backseat to anybody. Just from a talent, a depth standpoint. I mean, how long ago was it, Nick? 5 years ago, where Notre Dame Nation was just complaining about Notre Dame can't get top ends, they can't get top players. Well, Notre Dame's 2018 defensive end rotation, to your point, against Clemson, they had 4 kids play that game, significant minutes. Their rotation was Khalid Kareem and Julian Aguara were the starters. Jerry Tillery was inside a 3 technique. You had Adi Ogundeji and Dalen Hayes were your rotation guys. Well, all 4 of those ends have now been drafted. They weren't like backups that eventually played. They were all drafted. Jerry Tillery was a first-round pick. You had 5 guys get drafted from that defensive line, where in the past you wouldn't have 5 guys in the Notre Dame defense get drafted, much less 5 at 3 positions. And so but I think to your point, you had that Julian Love, Troy Pride duo. Then when Troy went or Julian went down, there was a drop off, but that secondary had 4 NFL players in it. The depth wasn't there. I think that's still a concern for me in the secondary. There's not a better safety in the country than Kyle Hamilton, but if he goes down, that's a problem.
Well, I
And
think
not the
that's
problem that everybody has when you lose Kyle Hamilton, which, yeah, he's your best player, but more of the drop off is more significant. There's more question marks at corner. I think the 2021 class helped kind of bridge that gap. You signed 4 good corners, you signed 2 really good safeties, but they have to balance that with another strong secondary class. And that to me is even more important than what I expect to be the nation's best linebacker class. They've already got Josh Burnham, who's a top 100 recruit. They've already got Nolan Ziegler, who's a consensus 4-star recruit. If they add consensus top 100 recruits in Jalen Seed and Junior Tuihalamaka, and not just from a recruiting ranking standpoint, because, Nick, you know my stance on recruiting rankings, but
right.
the film tells you the same story of the recruiting rankings in this instance. It's as good as you're going to get. But if you don't have guys who can cover Bama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma, then that's where the problem is. And so that's why it's so important to have that back-to-back strong class, because that's where Notre Dame has really been lacking on defenses. They've had great classes. The 2016 defensive line class had 4 defensive ends from that class got drafted, 1 class. The problem is, you know how many defensive tackles they signed in that class? 0. Do you know how many defensive ends they signed in the 2015 class? 0. That's been the problem, and that's what's starting to get rectified with some changes they've made. But Mike Elson being inserted as the new recruiting coordinator, combined with Marcus Freeman on board now as the defensive coordinator, that's where you're really starting to see changes. And I'm more confident now than I've been in the past that Notre Dame can actually win these battles. That Notre Dame's finished second or third a lot. I mean, a lot. It's not like they're not in the game for these kids. They just don't get them. That's going to be the key, Nick, is they've got to start. Mike Elson said it. We got to start getting these kids to say yes. I mean, it's not rocket science. We got to start getting these kids to say yes.
Brian, there is a comment that you just made that I've got to follow up on, and then another question that I've got for both of you, certainly. And one, The one has to do with recruiting rankings. So obviously, scouting is not perfect. Therefore, the recruiting rankings, much like the NFL draft, is going to miss it with certain players, whether projecting too high or too low. So that's just human error is already a problem. That's never going to go away. But you are basically saying that there is an inherent problem, or there is more than just human error involved in the miss on the recruiting rankings. Is there more involved when you made that comment in regards to them not being accurate?
No, that's not necessarily what I meant. What I meant is there's a difference between a 5-star kid in high school and a kid that's got a 5-star ceiling, to me. And that's where I'm coming from, is the recruiting rankings are geared towards looking for the guys that are ready to play right now. The difference between a 5-star recruited player and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is a 5-star linebacker like Jalen Smith shows up the day he steps foot on campus, he's ready to play. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah didn't play a single defensive snap for 2 years because there's different levels of development, right? Dalen Hayes was a 5-star recruit coming out of high school. Adi Ogundizi was a 3-star recruit that Notre Dame flipped from Western Michigan because he was only 215 pounds. They were both drafted in the same round. So it's more about, I think that I don't care about recruiting rankings because sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong, right? So how do you quantify which one's right and which one's wrong? You don't. You look at the tape. What does the tape tell you? And if you look at some of Notre Dame's best players, they've been 5-star commits. Jalen Smith was a 5-star. Manti Te'o was a 5-star. Some of them have been guys that nobody really knew about. Will Fuller was ESPN's lowest ranked Notre Dame commit in the 2013 class. I mean, right? So does that mean he all of a sudden got better at Notre Dame and he really wasn't that good? It's like when Kyle Hamilton committed Notre Dame, I graded him out as a 5-star. He was a consensus 3-star recruit from everywhere else. Did he all of a sudden get better, or did they finally come around to Kyle Hamilton? And so to me, that's where I come from, is I care about the talent, and more so what I meant, Mark, was the recruiting rankings part is what I find to be a flawed process. And in defense of the recruiting services, it's hard to find the right process to evaluate, because if you get subjective, then you put in your own built-in biases, and we all have evaluation biases, right? One of mine is I tend to not to over, like a big receiver. I had for a long time, I had a tendency to put more value on and not be as critical of maybe his athleticism as I should have been, right? So I had to build a grading system that somewhat negated my own built-in biases. We all have biases from evaluators of things that you prefer, right? But then when you do a point system, you don't take into account, are you building a correct roster, right? And so Florida State for years was finishing in the top 5, but kept having bad football teams. Why? Because they'd signed a bunch of highly ranked receivers and corners and linebackers, but they had the worst offensive line in the ACC. So yeah, they had highly ranked players, but they were having quarterback issues. Their offensive line was hot garbage, and there were holes in their roster that you couldn't tell by a points-driven recruiting ranking system. And so that's where I come from, the inherent flaw. And then they say, well, Alabama wins because of the recruiting rankings. Go look at Alabama's 2009 title team. That's not a highly ranked football team. Their 2 starting corners, Javier Arenas and Kareem Jackson, were 3-star recruits that had offers from like UConn and Bowling Green and Florida International. Their 2 outside linebackers, Eric Anders and not for the life of me, I cannot remember the other kid's name, were a 2 and a 3-star recruit, right? Now, they had some highly ranked kids, but they had one top 5 class that made up that football team. The big-time classes came as a result of them winning that title. The same thing with Clemson. Notre Dame had significantly better recruiting classes before Clemson's title team. This isn't my opinion. I'm just talking about what the actual rankings were. But they have then started to up their recruiting since they started playing for titles, right? And so that's my point, Mark, is that the way that a recruiting class is evaluated. So, Notre Dame has consistently 10 to 12 ranked classes, yet Notre Dame consistently ranks ahead of 10 to 12. And so to me, you look at the NFL draft, they don't produce the NFL draft from a 10 to 12 ranking. It's more of a top 5 to 7 ranking. And so either Notre Dame is the greatest evaluators and developers of talent, which there is some truth to that, or maybe there's some inherent biases in the recruiting rankings that maybe over rank the Southern players. So we all know the South has the best players, right? But if the South has 60% of the best players from producing players, but they're ranked in the top 80% are being ranked, then there's a gap there where you're missing from certain regions. And those are some of the things I look at and I say, there's just some biases that we have to look at. You look at the 2014 Ohio State team. People say, Ohio State had X number of 5-star players. Well, that's what they were as high school recruits. You go look at the linebacking core for Ohio State. They had a 5-star linebacker starting. His name was Curtis Grant. You go look at their other 2 linebackers, Darren Lee and Josh Perry, were both ranked much lower. Darren Lee was a 3-star recruit. Both were significantly better players than Curtis Grant, who was a 5-star, who I believe went undrafted. So was he really a 5-star linebacker? Even though technically they had a 5-star. That Ohio State team had, I believe, 7 consensus 3-star or composite 3-star recruits starting on offense. They had other highly ranked players on the bench. Now, they had some highly ranked guys. Ezekiel Elliott was a highly ranked guy, but Devin Smith was not. Evan Spencer was not. JT Barrett was not. 3 of their 4 starting offensive linemen, or 5 offensive linemen, I believe, from that class were also 3-star recruits. So I just think that I look at the tape. That's my thing. I look at the tape, and you can sign a top 100 recruit, and I can look at the tape and say, yeah, he may be ranked high, but that guy's not going to be a good player when he gets to college because he's just bigger and stronger than everybody else, which is why I think they tend to miss – we as analysts tend to miss on offensive linemen so much because what we see is the guy that's 310 now and just bullies people's now. What we don't see is the 255-pound kid with the broad shoulders, the big hands, the big feet that's going to put on 60 pounds of natural weight and goes on to be a top 10 NFL draft pick. And so to me, there are certain positions where it's even harder to evaluate. Well, some of those positions tend to produce players from regions that are also under-regarded from a recruiting ranking standpoint. But I also think that they tend to go to schools that why does Iowa produce tight ends so much? Again, either they know how to evaluate talent or they're the greatest tight end coaches of all time, right? And so that's my thing is show me the talent. Some schools recruit certain positions better than others, but show me the film, show me the talent. That's going to tell me a whole lot more than what a recruiting ranking that's simply based on points is going to tell me. So that's my long answer to your question.
Well, you definitely hit on a couple points as to why when I get asked this on a regular basis, what's more difficult to evaluate the players coming out of high school in the recruiting rankings toward college or the collegiate players for the NFL draft. And I say it's more difficult the high schooler to college because of the age. Number one, we're talking about growth of these guys getting recruited when they're 15 and 16 years old versus when they're going to be on a playing field for most colleges at 20 years old. That's a huge projection you have to make that you just spoke to, Brian. And number two, just the different levels of play at high school is so much more varied than at college, and the pool of players is enormous versus in college. When you're drafting a player out of the SEC, the Big Ten, we could go on down the line, you've got a very solid gauge on the caliber of player that player is facing every day in practice and in every game on the field.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's 100%. It's hard when you watch high school tape. Brian was just talking about that. That's how you evaluate. You have to watch the high school tape. And it gets so hard and so complicated even with that because what's the level of competition? I know that Tyler Buckner is the guy that got brought up with. You watch Tyler Buckner throw Notre Dame, for those that aren't aware, Notre Dame's prize quarterback recruit in this year's class. You watch him throw and you watch him in his tape, and you're like, this guy makes all the throws. This guy throws a ridiculous deep ball. Oh my God, his release is insanely fast. And then you go and you look and like, oh, well, he played his junior year in one of the weaker leagues or weaker divisions in California football. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see his senior year because COVID wiped that out. They played when he was already enrolled in the spring. But it's just even the level of competition. It throws everything for a loop. You kind of go in and you know some of those bias that we were just discussing of, all right, if you're evaluating a player to go to the NFL draft and maybe he plays in a group of 5 conference as opposed to the SEC or the Big 10 or Big 12, whatever it may be, and you kind of know that, okay, yeah, the level of competition isn't as high on a weekly basis. It's that much harder even when you don't know everything about all the schools, all the opponents, and it's just harder when you have literally 50 states that you're going through and just the depth of it. I think that it's a no doubt about it, no question about it. It's the high school to the college is tougher to kind of rank and evaluate.
Yeah, and I think it's the body part of it for me is the biggest one. Is just kids develop differently. You know, like people say, well, you know, did the recruiting services miss on this kid? Well, no, because at the time he was the best player. You know, so like a perfect example is Byron Cowart. You guys remember him? He went to Auburn, had the Chucky doll when he committed, then ended up in Maryland. Did everyone miss on Byron Cowart? Or was it just that when he signed with Auburn, that was as good as he was going to be? He had already filled out. He was already as big as he was going to be. He was already so much stronger. And when everybody caught up to him, you kind of saw the holes in his game. So did they miss him? No, because the film said at that time he was a dominant football player. But for me, when I looked at him, I said, you know, I don't see a guy that's going to get a whole lot better, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I look at and say, you have to be able to evaluate those things and say that, look, did they miss on a guy? Sometimes you can say it's a miss, but if you didn't think that they were wrong at the time, I don't think we can retroactively go back and look because of so much of this is just you don't know how bodies are going to develop. I mean, I don't think Ben Roethlisberger started in high school until what is like senior year. You know, I mean, there's just so many circumstances that can go into it that you have to say, look, let's just evaluate the film says, but understand that this is an inexact science. And I think, Nick, too, I'm curious of your thoughts on this. The fact that some of these services are putting so much more emphasis on summer camps, it means that we're going to get as many misses because of workouts as we've had in the NFL. How many times have we talked about in the NFL, boy, this kid did great at the combine. It was better in this film. He gets overdrafted, and then we get to the NFL, and guess what? He was the guy you saw in film, not the guy you saw in shorts. And I think that's, to me, another issue that is impacting the rankings, especially. There's one service especially that is getting pretty bad with that compared to the others.
Yeah, and I know like this year it's weird with this year because states were playing different months. Some played in the fall, some played in the winter, some played in the spring, some played 6-game schedule, some played full schedule.
Some didn't play.
It was everything for a loop. Yeah, so it limited tape and every part of that. But I'm with you. It's if I'm being able to choose game tape. Oh, he worked out well, and he was faster than so-and-so at the speed camp, and he was this he won one-on-one drills in camp when they weren't wearing pads, weren't wearing helmets. Give me the guy that showed up on game day. Give me that.
Right.
Whether it's the NFL and you're talking about the combine and the draft, or if it's college and you're talking about high school kids with it, give me the game tape 10 times out of 10.